Welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast
with Garrett Williamson.
Health, wellness, exercise, nutrition, and a whole lot more. Got questions? Call us and leave a message at 251-278-EDGE or message us at Personal Edge Fitness on Facebook and Instagram, at Team PE on Twitter, or personaledgefitness.com.
Welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Garrett Williamson. The power of the mind. You've heard this quite often. Actually, let me ask you, Pablo, what percentage of our brain do we use? I'm curious what your answer would be.
I heard it was 3%.
Well, not me and you, pal. Normal folks or whatever. The percentage that's thrown out quite often is 10%. That we only use 10% of our brains. People have gotten a lot of traction on it. And that came out originally in Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which was published back in the 1930s. And I believe that's probably why it got so much popularity. But believe it or not, that was debunked in a study published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. Now, the reason I bring this up is the fact that we actually use all of our brain. We're using all the brain all the time. So the notion that a person uses only 10% of the brain is truly a myth. MRI scans that shows that even simple activities require almost all of the brain. First established in 1945, scientists estimated that the brain is about 73% water on top of that. The reason I bring that up so early is if you're, of course, you're a follower of this podcast, you know what that means. I'm right at 100 ounces today. I hope you're keeping up. That's me taking in water. Remember, we got a little drinking game going on. I want everybody to stay hydrated, and I do mean water. I'm not interested in starting another Hey Bob phenomenon. So every time you hear me drink, I want you to take a sip of water, and please, folks, stay hydrated. Now, back to what I was talking about. And one of the reasons I stay hydrated is that the brain is about 73% water, and keeping the brain hydrated is extremely important. In fact, being dehydrated by as little as 2% may impair your ability to perform tasks that involve attention, memory, and motor skills. I always tell my wife, darling, it's not that I wasn't listening, it's just I'm dehydrated. And so after 23 years, she's not falling for it anymore. Now, that's the brain, but I'm going to talk about a small portion of it. In fact, I'm going to talk about a portion today that's about 1/8 the size of the entire brain, and it's the cerebellum. The reason being, the cerebellum controls balance. Balance is not a physical thing. It's not something that it comes and goes, that we lose or what have you. It actually is it's a function of the brain. It's a function of the cerebellum. And there's amazing things that we can do when it comes to balance, especially when it comes to the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is located in the back of the brain. It controls balance. It also controls coordination and fine muscle control, like walking and what have you. What's interesting about the cerebellum is how it receives information. It receives information from what we call a feed-forward procession. Now, I'm going to give a brief description of that, and then I'm going to break that down for you because I like the KISS method of keep it simple, stupid. And what feed-forward processing is that signals move unidirectionally through that system from input to output with very little recurrent internal transmission. Now, I'm sure everybody's got that and fully understands what feed-forward processing is. But what it basically is, the cerebellum acts like the RAM in your computer. It's not going to store a bunch of stuff or whatever. It's just going to process it. The information is going to come in. It's going to go out. It's just going to process it. And the reason that's significant and what it has to do with what we're talking about today is balance, is keeping that neuropathway, as we call it, activated. Keeping it up and going is the key to balance. There's some muscle involvement, don't get me wrong, but the real key to balance is that RAM procedure, that feed-forward processing in the cerebellum. If you don't understand the RAM analogy real quick, I'll make this simple for you, especially in the state that I live in. It's the Little Caesars hot and ready pizza as opposed to the have it made your way. Thank you. Thank you very much, Pablo. Yes. Now I think everybody is on board exactly with how the cerebellum processes information. When these communication pathways go dormant due to lack of use, well, you know the old adage, and you've heard me say it before. You'll hear me say it many more times, and that is that if you don't use it, you lose it. Well, when those pathways go dormant, that's when our balance is affected. That's when we have difficulty with balance. And I promise you that has absolutely nothing to do with time passing on a calendar. Keeping these neural pathways open, obviously, is the common modus operandi of balance. Let me tell you a little bit about the life cycle balance. I keep mentioning age, but evidently most people believe that you have balance when you're younger and then it kind of passes away. Well, let's start there. Like I say, the life cycle balance, and this is when you're born. One of the first things you learn to control is your head. If you've ever held a toddler or an infant or a newborn, you know to support their head. Those muscles haven't developed. That's a very heavy object. An adult, that object is somewhere between 8 and 10 pounds. It's not that heavy in a child, but the neck muscles haven't developed strong enough to hold it. Well, once they start developing the strength and holding their head straight, then they start opening their eyes and they start to make what I call the eye-head or eye-brain coordination. The eyes stop wandering around and start learning how to fixate on certain objects and what have you. And that sends communication to the cerebellum. Also, at this time, core muscles start to develop. If you had a child, then you probably remember the exciting moment when they sat up for the first time. That was really huge. And I've seen babies in bouncy seats sit up and lean back, sit up and lean back, like they're bouncing back and forth. Well, they're actually doing a simple core strengthening exercise. Believe it or not, they're sitting up, which is firing the abdominal muscles, and they're actually throwing themselves backwards, which is working the lower back muscles. So we then start to walk. We start encouraging them to crawl, then walk. The first thing they usually do is stand up. And if you watch them, they'll typically stand up and they'll focus for a minute before they actually start to take a step. Typically, it's not stand up and then just start moving. It's stand up, focus, and then take a step. I always tell people, when you want to learn something about balance, watch a toddler and watch for the wobble. And what I mean by that is when they're standing up and they're about to take that first step, there's usually some wobbling going on. Sometimes they'll wobble and they fall down. That wobbling is their cerebellum learning how to coordinate. Their RAM is developing and they're trying to figure out exactly how to process these thoughts coming through and firing the right muscles and what have you. So this moves on from standing up to walking around to running and what have you, being able to do these things without holding on. Well, what's going on? Your body follows your head and your head follows your eyes. And so this is why you're seeing this development of balance. This may not seem important to you, except for the fact that it's going to come into play a little on down the line, a little farther down the life cycle. When we become children, we do a little bit more of what I call advanced balance training. And we have advantages at that time. We typically have a lower center of gravity. There's very little fear. We don't know that touching a hot stove is hot yet until we touch it. So we're not so scared of jumping off objects and pretty much cause nightmares with mothers. That fear has a lot to do with it. We're also an inquiring mind. We're excited. We're wanting to take these challenges and whatever. So we're starting to challenge our balance. We're starting to do things like balance on a curb or simple games, hopscotch, foursquare, and tag. These are things that are causing us to do balance activities like standing on one foot. They're also causing us to do zigzag motions, running side to side like foursquare and tag. And so we're working on sending messages through that cerebellum, sending messages to the brain, learning, making that cerebellum, instead of it being a little dirt road, into an 8-lane superhighway. And that starts happening when we get into doing agility work and getting into sports as teenagers, youth sports too. But when you get into teenage years, you start to get a little more focus. Defensive backs, linebackers, running backs, quarterbacks, even a lineman, they have to know how to have that first step quickness, be able to move laterally fast, do spin motions. These are all advanced balance techniques that we do, and we have to train our body to do them. That's why you see repetitive drills going on. We're actually training our brain as much as we're training our body. There's a lot of individual sports that, of course, require balance. Gymnastics, cheerleading, dance, wrestling, judo. If you can get your opponent off balance, you can use his own weight against him. But we also see it, like I say, in the competitive sports. There's a lot of mental training, but I told you there was a lot of physical too. And the reason I bring up the physical is that has a lot to do also with why we seem to lose balance as time passes on the calendar, which, like I say, we don't. So let's get to the life cycle of when we get older and we find balance challenges. Well, what happens? Our lifestyle changes. If you're listening to this and you happen to be over the age of 20 even, or 22, and you don't have children, think, when was the last time you played tag? When's the last time you challenged yourself to balance on a curb? Can you remember the last time you played hopscotch? Is there anybody that knows what hopscotch is? The reason I guess I've used that reference is that I still have clients play it today just to work on their balance. But when you stop moving laterally, we stop using those muscles that control those movements, the adductors, the abductors, that's ADD and ABD ductors, and also the medial glute muscles that stop moving us side to side. You stop using it, then you start to lose it. And so those muscles degenerate, you lose balance. You're not able to control that lateral movement as well. And if you watch somebody that has lost their balance, and usually it's somebody that is older, their lifestyle has taken them away from those activities, you watch them when they go to walk. They're going to do it a lot like a toddler does. They're going to ask you, which direction are we going? They're going to point themselves in that direction and try to move completely linear, try to make sure they don't move sideways whatsoever. They develop this, like going backwards, like back into a toddler stage. They develop this because of the fear of falling and because of those muscles being degenerated. Just like the muscles degenerating, the brain and the neural pathways start to go dormant. They go from their 8-lane superhighway when we're playing sports and we're playing tag and we're balancing on curbs and we're learning how to zigzag and spin and what have you. We stop doing those things, so that 8-lane superhighway goes right back to that dirt road that we had when we were children. And since we see a lot of people doing it, we believe, well, that's what happens to me. And it's not true. We can make it an 8-lane superhighway just like we did when we were kids. Well, how you do it, it's basically the same way. And I'm going to give you a simple 6-step plan to return you to balance if you've lost your balance, or to just improve your balance. It has a lot to do with your fitness level. It has a lot to do with, of course, longevity, because the incidence of mortality jumped by 2/3 with the first hip fracture. I think I've probably said that in another podcast. And so we want to make sure that we maintain our balance. Plus, it makes you a little more confident. If it makes you confident, then you're going to feel like you were when a kid. First time you ever achieved some kind of major trial as far as balance is concerned. I bring that up because I'm thinking of a 3-year-old kid. It's kind of a neat story. I coached him in gymnastics. That's another one right there. Make sure you're taking in your water. Make sure you're staying hydrated. But anyway, it reminds me of a 3-year-old kid. I actually coached him in gymnastics. And what was amazing to me, and this is the first time I'd had an experience with somebody this young and dealing with this particular feat, as you would call it. And it may not seem amazing. I've got plenty of stories of athletes that do all kinds of incredible things, but this 3-year-old ran across a mat. Back when I was coaching, and well before the PC days, it was called a crash mat. They can't call it that now. They have to call it a skill cushion, which I think is ridiculous. But anyway, it's a crash mat. It's a very soft mat, but it's about 8 to 10 inches off the ground. And running across this thing is almost like running in wobbly mud. And so this kid could run across that at 3 years old now. He could run across that, jump off of an 18-inch mat, which is about half his height, land on a floor solid as you and me, at least when our teenage years, and then just keep on sprinting across the floor. And they thought that was incredible. To bring that story to full circle, the kid had learned his eye-mind coordination and learned his balance very early on. He ended up being a phenomenal soccer player, which is interesting enough because that's who we use to teach agility to any of our athletes as a soccer player. The reason I brought you down that story is just like the way he developed that ability at such an early age. You tell that to somebody that's lost their balance, and they'd be terrified of doing what that 3-year-old kid did. But his neuropathways, his cerebellum had become that 8-lane superhighway at an early age. And I'm going to tell you the 6 steps to get that back. Now, number 1 is a simple exercise. You can do this holding on, and that's one-legged stands. What we want to do is we want to kind of see where you are. So we want to hold on to something, hold on to a couple things. Usually I put 2 chairs without wheels on them, and I turn them facing away from me, but I stand in between them. So basically, I've got the backs of the chairs right up against me, and I'm holding on to those chairs. And I'm just going to raise 1 foot off the ground and see how comfortable I feel there. But before you do that one-legged stand, and before you do any kind of balance exercise, we've got to get the brain and the eyes working together. So what we're going to do is we're going to do what every gymnast does when you see them spinning on the balance beam. We're going to do the same thing that dancers do, the same thing that cheerleaders do, the same thing that, believe it or not, some fighting sports do. We're going to pick a spot. We're going to zero in on it. It's called a focus point. We're going to find a focus point. You're going to stare at something on the wall and literally stare. See if you can get yourself into a blank stare. And the reason I say that is if, again, your body follows your head, head follows your eyes. If you can keep your eyes still and you're focused on a point, not looking all around it, but literally focused on a point, you'll be able to hold that balance. The only thing that would be difficult for you is if you do have some weakness in the thighs or what have you, then that's going to present itself. But you'll most likely will feel that. So careful with it. Raising one leg, bending your knee to about 45 degrees and holding for about 5 to 10 seconds. Good way to challenge your balance. Find you can do it. You're a little scared. Don't want to let go of the chairs. Fine. Repeat the exercise. Keep trying it till you feel a bit more comfortable. Second way is heel-toe walking. You can walk, and this sounds strange, but you can walk with the heel of the front foot touching the toe of the back foot as you take 10 steps forward. Now, this is just like walking on a balance beam. Now, the funny thing about this is that the field sobriety test, and I told you that balance is in the brain. Well, if your brain gets affected, it's going to throw off your balance, which is why they use that as a field sobriety test. So if you're inebriated, of course, your balance is affected. Therefore, it's going to change the way you walk. And this heel-toe walking is exactly what they're doing there, just kind of walking a line. Believe it or not, if you get really good at it, you can pass a field sobriety test. It's like swinging 2 bats on the on-deck circle. If you make it a little more difficult, do it with your eyes closed, you'll be able to... Anyway, I'm not here talking about that in the drinking I'm talking about is water only, and I hope you're keeping up. Okay, number 3 is sidestepping. Now, the reason I bring this up is back to that lateral movement. We stop doing lateral movement. We stop moving side to side. It's going to greatly affect our balance. Simply stepping to the right and then bringing your left foot to meet your right foot and step back to the left or keep going the same direction. Once you get pretty good at it, you can actually do cross-stepping, what some people call grapevine. You're basically crossing one foot over the other. But again, that's working the hips. Remember to pick your spot, focus on it, and that's going to do the same thing. It's going to challenge the hips, it's going to challenge the brain, and help build those neural pathways going back to that 8-lane superhighway. Once you get feeling more comfortable, let's say you've mastered all those, not in the same day. Let's say you've mastered those, you're very comfortable with them, you're able to do that crossover step without a problem. Well, then you want to go to an unassisted standing up from a chair. Now, it sounds crazy, I know, but I had a client that their goal was that they always wanted to be able to get up off the toilet without using their hands. Now, honestly, folks, that's actually an awesome goal. So if you can do that, you can do that unassisted standing up out of a chair, especially when your knee is about 90 degrees. Well, then try it one-legged. Now, that sounds crazy. You might want something to hold on the first time you do it, but try it one-legged, leaning forward, picking a point before you get started, and standing up. Now, that's what's happening is you're moving your body and moving your head through different planes. You're starting at a low point, moving up to a higher point. You're having to move and change your focus a bit. And so that's what you're challenging there. Plus, it's working those hip muscles. It's challenging those hip muscles and helping them make those fine motor movements that keep you standing and keep you from wobbling. If you're wanting help in this area, number 5 is fantastic, and that is called a dynamic stretching class. You may not have heard this, but let me tell you what this is, because some people don't care for stretching, and think it's painful or what have you. But dynamic stretching, it's a movement-based type of stretching. It uses the muscles themselves to bring about a stretch, but it's different than traditional or what we call static stretching because the position is not held. You actually pass through it. But it has you both feet on the ground, but you're doing these movements and moving your head especially through different planes in a slow controlled movement. And that's going to, again, it's going to work on coordination. Anything that works on coordination, agility, or balance is going to strengthen those neural pathways or open up those neural pathways in the cerebellum and help your balance. That's for sure. Number 6 is the last one. Believe it or not, this is going to sound simple. You're going to think that I should have started with this. A lot of people tell me that they think their balance is related to their feet, and a lot of times it can be. Mainly it's the feeling in their feet. And decreased circulation makes you feel numb. You know, if you've ever arms gone to sleep, quote unquote, that's decreased circulation, therefore making you feel numb. Well, a lot of people have this in their feet. They have poor circulation in their legs. And this can happen anytime anybody is somewhat dormant. If you're lying in bed, the first thing that you'll do, and this is number 6, and that is ankle pumping. And it's when you get out of bed, if you're prone to dizziness when standing or what have you, you can sit on the edge of the bed for a few seconds and pump your ankles before you stand up. It's like pushing a gas pedal. Just simply pumping your feet, pumping your ankles, and what have you. All that's it's going to increase circulation down into your feet and through your legs. Also, it's a great exercise to do prior to, let's say you're working on a slack line. Let's say you've got your balance mastered and you're doing a slack line or you're doing some kind of advanced climbing or even walking across a beam or whatever it is. Pumping your feet, pumping those ankles, increasing circulation, increases the sensory in your feet, probably the best way to say that, and allows you to have better control. But if you do this, especially if you have trouble when you get out of bed with it, start pumping those ankles. That'll wake them up, and that'll make you feel much more confident in standing up. And again, back to the brain, we're building confidence. We're not just keeping you from falling. We're not just making it so it's easier to do a more advanced lift, an advanced exercise, or some advanced sport. What we're actually doing is we're building your confidence. The more we build your confidence, you'll start to realize you can challenge things like you did when you were a kid. This goes back to my mantra of the fact that aging has nothing to do with fitness. It doesn't dictate your health. And of course, that's more to come. Don't let me go down that rabbit hole. This is one of the myths of aging. Don't even think about that. If you're more into the advanced sports, if you're more into the advanced exercises, I promise you, you may think that, well, that's something for my grandmother. That's something for if I ever become unbalanced. And since I'm going to be bulletproof all my life, that's never going to happen. No, believe it or not, even in advanced lift, if you're a triathlete, do endurance type sports, agility training, balance training, anything training that cerebellum, promise you, as you get tired in those sports, that fine motor skills will aid you greatly. And it's something that everybody should work on and practice. That's all for today on Balance. If you have any questions about that, feel free to call us. Make sure you're liking this on Facebook. Share us out there. Make sure you come back next week. Next week, we're going to be getting into one of my other favorite myths, and that's this whole metabolism thing. What is it? How does it work? How do I affect it? And most importantly, how do I speed it up? I'm your host, Garrett Williamson. Stay hydrated.
Thanks for listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Subscribe now and be a part of the show by calling 251-222-5255 888-278-EDGE or message us on Facebook and Instagram at Personal Edge Fitness or at Team PE on Twitter, and visit us at personaledgefitness.com.